Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mike Eisenstadt, Senior Con Fellow and Director of the Military and Security Studies Program at the Washington Institute, and welcome to today's event on Russia's deepening military involvement in Syria, implications for the United States and the region. Russia's September 2015 military intervention in Syria heralded its return to the Middle East as a major military and diplomatic actor. Since then, it has created in Syria an anti-access area denial bubble, which we have a graphic here courtesy of the Institute for Study of War, which shows the air defense, shore-based anti-ship cruise missile, and ground-to-ground missile range fans, as well as the naval squadron offshore, which potentially complicate U.S. military operations in the Eastern Mediterranean and over Syria. Indeed, U.S. and Russian forces, in the guise of private military contractors from the Wagner Group, have already clashed in eastern Syria in February of this year, and U.S. AC-130 gunships have been subjected to jamming, presumably by Russian forces. Moreover, as a result of the accidental shoot-down of a Russian Ilyushin-20 reconnaissance aircraft a few weeks ago by Syrian air defenses, Russia has transferred advanced S-300 surface-to-air missiles to Syria, although it will reportedly take several months to train the Syrian crews. And it is not clear whether these will be jointly operated and therefore subject to Russian control or wholly Syrian operated, though it seems hard to believe the Russians will allow the Syrians kind of unilateral control over these assets, at least initially, in light of the poor fire discipline demonstrated by Syrian air defenses. And in the last few weeks, the U.S. has also indicated that it will be keeping its 2,000 troops currently ensconced in northeastern Syria with Syrian democratic forces east of the Euphrates River to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS and the departure of Iranian forces and proxy militias under Tehran's control. Given the Assad regime's reliance on Iranian forces and pro-Iranian militias to maintain its grip over the country, this seems like a formula for a long-term U.S. military commitment there. Thus, U.S. and Russian forces will continue to operate in proximity to each other, posing challenges for deconfliction. And Syria's acquisition of the S-300 could affect U.S., Turkish, and Israeli air operations over Syria in the months and years to come. And I should note that the U.S. and coalition forces have twice already struck at Syrian chemical weapons facilities in the past year and a half, and U.S., UK, and France recently reiterated that the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons once again would prompt an even harsher response next time. So the S-300 adds an additional layer of complexity to this calculus. So the situation in Syria is becoming increasingly complex, and the challenge of deconflicting operations and perhaps managing escalation is becoming even more demanding. To discuss these and other issues, we are happy to have with us today Anna Borshchevskaya, Robert Hamilton, and Steven Zaloga. Anna is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute focusing on Russia's policy towards the Middle East. She's author of Russia in the Middle East, Motives, Consequences, and Prospects, which was published by the Institute in 2016. She previously held positions with the Atlantic Council and the Peterson Institute for International Economics and worked as an analyst for a U.S. military contractor in Afghanistan. Robert Hamilton is a retired U.S. Army colonel, a former Eurasian FAO, foreign area officer, and he's an associate professor of Eurasian studies at the U.S. Army War College and a Black Sea Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He served as a strategic war planner and country desk officer at the U.S. Central Command and writes often on Russian military affairs. He was the first director of the U.S. ground deconfliction cell with Russian forces in Syria in 2017, and he is the author of Russian and American deconfliction efforts in Syria, What's the Endgame in the Civil War? Which was published by the Foreign Policy Research Institute very recently. Finally, we have Steven Zaloga, who is a highly regarded defense analyst at the Teal Group and prolific author who specializes in Russian and Soviet militaries and World War II. He is author of Soviet air defense missiles, published by Janes, which is kind of a classic in its field, and has written technical analyses of Soviet and Russian systems for Jane's Intelligence Review, Jane's Defense Weekly, and Unmanned Systems Magazine. Before we start, I just ask everybody to turn off their cell phones, and with no further ado, we will ask Anna to start. So thank you, and thank you all for being here today.
Good afternoon, and thank you everybody else for coming, and thank you, Mike, for the introduction. I'd like to start by recalling that September 30th, which was just several days ago, marks the third anniversary of Russia's official intervention in Syria. So Putin has been officially in Syria for 3 years now. And I'd like to frame this in the context of our discussion. And I'd like to start by talking about Moscow's interests and objectives in Syria, but also the rest of the region. Putin worked consistently and systematically to return Russia to the Middle East since he officially came to power. This return did not begin with the Syrian intervention in 2015. Putin wanted Russia back in this region in the context of zero-sum anti-Westernism. For Russia to win, the United States had to lose. Syria is a strategically vital country in the region with whom the Kremlin historically had a special relationship during the Cold War, and it was similarly critical to Putin's calculus in the region. But that said, he had his eyes on the entire region beyond Syria alone. He worked to regain political, diplomatic, and economic influence, increase cooperation in diplomatic exchanges, arms sales, energy sales, and provision of high technology goods such as nuclear reactors. The one difference with his approach to the region is that it was not rooted in any ideology, unlike the Soviet Union. Putin has been unconstrained, and his approach was to talk to everybody in the region, whether traditional friend or foe. And really by 2010, he already gained much influence in the Middle East and North Africa. And we're certainly seeing Russia playing an increasingly influential role in the region. Just to give a few examples, Egypt is turning more and more towards Russia. Russia is in fact now building Egypt's nuclear reactor. Egypt used to be our partner on nuclear energy security, but no more. Russia has been very active in Libya. And in fact, today marks the 1-year anniversary when Saudi King Salman made a historic trip to Moscow. Sorry. Okay. Certainly, the Russian intervention in Syria brought the Russia-Iran alliance to new heights, but that said, Putin worked to build relations with Iran prior to the intervention as well. And we now see Russia becoming more active in Africa, and the Middle East is likely providing a useful springboard for these activities. So prior to the intervention, Putin supported Assad unequivocally and in multiple ways from the very beginning when protests broke out against Assad in March 2011. He ultimately intervened because he perceived weakness from the West. He capitalized on Western retreat from the region, or at least perceived Western retreat. His main objective is to stay in power, and for the Kremlin, staying in power is often about the U.S. or more broadly the West, both using it as a foil on whom to blame its own failings, and as a partner whose elites it can corrupt through engagement. This is the context for understanding his Syria intervention. And for Putin, Syria provided an amazing opportunity to capture so many of these interests as they pertain to his larger goals. And this was projecting Russia's great power status and forcing the West to treat him as an equal, weakening the West by helping Assad flood Europe with refugees, distracting from the Ukraine crisis and working to force the West into dialogue on its own terms on Ukraine. It was also a domestic distraction for the Russian public, and this is an underemphasized area of interest for the Kremlin. Historically, Russia has a tendency, or the Russian state, I should say, has a tendency to get more aggressive internationally at times of domestic problems. It searches for distractions. And to turn the West, Putin's fear of regime change, be it the color revolutions in the post-Soviet space or what he believes were U.S.-sponsored protests in the Middle East during the Arab Spring. Syria provided a perfect training ground for the Russian military, a testing and advertising arena for Russian weaponry to boost arms sales. Reducing U.S. ability to maneuver in the region. Thus, the military hardware that Russia brought to Syria was more useful not in fighting ISIS, but supporting Assad and creating the so-called A2AD, anti-aerial access denial bubbles. These bubbles are about creating buffer zones, and the Russian state has a history of searching for buffer zones. The difference here is that it's not a physical but a virtual buffer zone, but a buffer zone nonetheless. And of course, seeking access to warm water ports, which is another opportunity that Syria provided. So prior to the incident with the downing of the Russian reconnaissance Ilyushin 20 plane, Putin had achieved many of his key objectives in Syria. He projected great power status, created a perception of somebody that everybody can talk to in the region. He boosted Russia's arms sales, temporarily distracted the Russian public, although that's less of an issue now than it was before. The A2AD layout, I would say, succeeded partially, but partial success still matters. Moreover, he ensured Russia's long-term military presence in Syria. And this presence is a useful springboard for growing, for gaining access for the rest of the region. So he had a weak hand, but he played it very well. Putin does want a resolution to the Syrian crisis, but on his own terms. And ultimately, I would argue that will not bring long-term stability to Syria. Now, the downing of the Ilyushin 20 plane was a big embarrassment. No matter how much Moscow blames Israel for this incident, it showed both Putin and Assad as fairly incompetent. But paradoxically, by delivering the S-300 system, Moscow is asserting itself. It's a political statement. It's a statement of trying to gain further dominance in Syria, and it's a statement to the West and to everybody else in the region, but I would argue primarily to the West. To be sure, many critical elements remain unknown, as Mike had already alluded in his opening remarks. I also have doubts that, at least initially, Moscow will let Syrians operate the S-300 independently. And this incident raises many questions. Moscow may very well find it harder to maintain the balance of good relations that it had with everybody in the region. Up till now, Putin has managed the balance of good relations between Israel and Iran. Going forward, this raises a possibility that this may no longer work. I would argue much depends on what steps the United States is going to take from here. Certainly the U.S. decision to remain in Syria that Mike has mentioned is already problematic for Putin because he wants us to leave Syria. Ultimately, he succeeded to date because there's been very little pushback against him, and if there is, it's possible that the tables might turn. And I'd like to conclude with a few words on the Russian domestic situation, which is always a very important context for Russian foreign policy. The Russian economy continues on a slow path to deterioration, and Putin's current presidential term, I'd argue, is not a very easy one. And this is why we see the Kremlin increasingly playing up the besieged narrative fortress that has such deep roots in Russia. Protest activity has been ongoing, and the recent pension reform has been incredibly unpopular. That created a new wave of protests. Last month, during regional elections, a number of Putin-endorsed candidates lost, which is pretty hard to do when the election is already rigged to begin with. It raises a question that many people might be thinking anyone but Putin. Certainly, that's a sentiment you hear expressed. Putin's latest approval ratings that came out just this month show the lowest level since prior to his annexation of Crimea. His regime, the Putin regime, has shown to be remarkably resilient, and certainly the story is not over. But it's hard to tell which way Russia is headed, and I'd like to end on this note of uncertainty. There's a lot of questions here, and I look forward to discussing them. Thank you.
Okay. So first, I want to thank Mike and the Washington Institute for the invitation. It's always a pleasure, and I say this. So I'm at the Army War College in Carlisle, and when we have visitors from D.C., they always say it's so great to be out of D.C. for the day. For me, it's actually great to get into D.C. for the day, as long as I can get out before the traffic, which this will allow me to. I do love coming down here. I like the energy of the city. Carlisle is a fairly sleepy place, and so thank you for the invitation, Mike. Happy to be here. I do have to do the standard Department of Defense disclaimer and say that the views I'm about to express are my own and do not represent the policy or views of the Department of Defense, U.S. Army, or U.S. Army War College. So with that out of the way, I could be very easily the shortest presenter of the day by saying prospects for Syria and U.S. Russian relations, neither are good. What are your questions? I won't do that. I will talk through a few things. Anna did such a comprehensive job of explaining Russia's goals in Syria that I have a slide that talks to that. Luckily, my slide is very, very consistent with what Anna said, which makes me feel good, because this is something that I think she probably knows better than anybody. I'll skip over that slide, talk a little bit about the U.S. and Russian deconfliction effort in Syria on the ground mostly, We have an air-to-air deconfliction and a ground deconfliction effort. And then just some observations from my time running the ground deconfliction cell and my time studying Russia and Syria on what I believe they're after in Syria in terms of immediate objectives and how they are trying to achieve them, and then an assessment of kind of where they've been successful militarily and where they still have some shortcomings, and then end up with some unresolved issues. So this is the slide I'll skip over because, again, it's very consistent with Anna's. So 2 must-haves in any military briefing are PowerPoint slides and a line and block chart. So here's your, this is the overall U.S. ground command that is responsible for the counter-ISIS fight in Iraq and Syria. And so the 4-star U.S. Central Command out of Tampa and Qatar, and then below that is what we call CJTF OIR, Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve. 3-star command, split between Kuwait and Iraq, and it has responsibility for the counter-ISIS fight in both Iraq and Syria. Below that, there are 2 2-star commands. One's the land component, and one's the Special Operations Command. Special Operations Command, which is on the right of the slide, is they are most active in Syria. Of the U.S. forces that are active in Syria on the ground, most of them, or many of them, belong to the Special Operations Command. The deconfliction process, this is what it kind of looks like, again, in a line and block chart. The 3-star headquarters, again, that's the CJTF OIR at the top. You had the Special Operations Task Force. Where we were, the Russian deconfliction cell at the bottom goes through the CJ3, which was the Operations Directorate. So we worked for the Operations Director. We had kind of 2 major tie-ins. One was to the air deconfliction side, which is the blue box in the bottom right. So my counterpart there was an Air Force colonel working out of the Combined Air Operations Center. And he and his team there, very small team. It was a colonel and 3 or 4 interpreters, and it was me and 3 or 4 interpreters in Kuwait, did all the air-to-air deconfliction with the Russian Air Force over Syria. Our little team did the ground deconfliction with Russian ground forces inside Syria. On the left side of the chart is the Russian Reconciliation Center at Hmeimim Air Force Base in Syria. And so we would tie in with them on a daily basis, usually phone calls or emails, and I have a slide, I'll talk about that in a minute. They work for the 3-star headquarters, the group of Russian forces in Syria, also at Hmeimim. Okay, what's the process? Well, first of all, deconfliction is not a word, right? I mean, it's not a thing in the English language, or it wasn't until a couple of years ago. We called it deconfliction because legally that's what we had to call it. In other words, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2017, there was language inserted that said the United States Department of Defense is legally prohibited from cooperating or coordinating with the Russian armed forces, but also allowed us to deconflict in Syria. And so the language of the NDAA, the Defense Authorization Act, is what we took. And so we always had to be very careful talking to the Russians that we were not crossing a line into doing coordinated operations or actual military cooperation. We were more often close to being on the other side of the line. In other words, the relationship was contentious enough and dynamic enough that it was more likely that the deconfliction process would break down than we would actually get to the point where we were coordinating or cooperating. The reason we do deconfliction on the ground there now is we had a couple of what I would call near misses on the ground that culminated in one near Atanf, which is in southern Syria, in the tri-border region, Iraq, Jordan, and Syria, in June of 2017, at which point the ground commander said, I have to have my own deconfliction capability. Until then, it had been running through the air deconfliction cell in Qatar. But he said, I need my own kind of organic capability because the air and ground deconfliction missions are a little bit different. And so anyway, late summer 2017, it was stood up, and it continues there today. The way we interact with the Russians is email and phone calls. There are test phone calls every day, and there are usually 2 or 3 substantive phone calls every day, just about movements of forces or deconfliction zones or things like that. It depended on what was going on, but normally the 3 stars, the commanders would talk about monthly or as required. At the 1-star level, about every couple of weeks, and then the chiefs of operations was a daily thing, and then inside the cell it was daily. And what we were talking about and continue to talk about is the proposals for deconfliction zones, which are zones where either neither side will go or one side will go exclusively or both sides can go with notification, notifications of strikes, locations of forces, and then de-escalation of incidents. Okay, so what are the Russians, this is my opinion, what are the Russians after in Syria with respect to the United States specifically? One of the things they've started to do over the last year or so is challenge the legality of the U.S. presence in Syria by arguing that they were invited in by the legitimate government of Syria, the United States was not, and therefore the United States is there illegally. The United States has always based its presence on 2 things. One, a request from the Iraqi government because of the attacks coming across the border into Iraq from Syria, and 2, the Article 51 self-defense, UN Charter Article 51 self-defense language that says states that are attacked from another state have a right to defend themselves. The idea being that a lot of the ISIS attacks in our allied and partner states were emanating from Syria. So that's been our legal grounds for being in Syria. The Russians have started to challenge that. Disinformation, there's a consistent narrative in the Russian press, in the Russian Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that the U.S. supports ISIS in Syria. It doesn't matter how much we bomb, how many bombs we drop on ISIS, and how much territory we take from ISIS, where if you look at the maps, the U.S. and its partner force have taken essentially all of northern and eastern Syria away from ISIS, out of the hands of ISIS. The Russian narrative continues to be the U.S. supports ISIS. Every once in a while, they would strike the U.S. partner force, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is a Sunni Arab and Kurd coalition, operates mostly in northern and eastern Syria. There were times when they were uncomfortable with the pace of our operations on the east bank of the Euphrates, and they would strike. Most of the time, I think they intended to strike close to, but several times they struck and bombs actually fell on the partner force. They came across the Euphrates River just south of Deir ez-Zor in September of last year, grabbed some land, and that's where they launched the attack in February of this year that the U.S. then, with the Wagner Group, that the U.S. then responded to. They launched that attack from that little box east of the Euphrates where they had come across last September. I'm not sure if the reason they came across was to try to get oil infrastructure or to try to deter the SDF from moving farther south, or whether it's intended to be something they can trade later to get us out of areas where we are on what they consider their side of the river. So hard to say. This is one of probably the best known proof, this is Russian proof of U.S. support for ISIS. This is a Russian MOD released a photo claiming to show U.S. forces leading ISIS out of Abu Kamal, which is a city in southern Syria. The charge was this is a U.S. convoy leading ISIS fighters out of Abu Kamal and into Iraq, where then the U.S. would protect them. Some enterprising young gamer at some point said, hey, that looks a lot like that AC-130 gunship simulator game, that was really popular a few years ago. And so it's an exact screenshot. It's a screenshot. When the U.S. publicized this, the Russian MOD response was, well, that was a mistake, but the U.S. still supports ISIS, right? So in other words, it doesn't refute the fact that the U.S. supports ISIS, the fact that we grabbed a screenshot from a game. What would I say, what have they done well, I think, in Syria, and what have they struggled? Leveraging a commercial shipping for sea lift has been a success. The Syrian Express has done a fairly good job of supporting their contingent in Syria, and they don't have the military sea lift to do it, so they've leveraged commercial sea lift. Sustainment of the sortie rate, in other words, given the number of aircraft they have on the ground, they fly them at a rate, especially when there's escalations, that I think in the U.S. Air Force, they're accepting very high risk, in other words, but they've managed to sustain that sortie rate now for 3 years, as Anna said. and been fairly successful at it. So that risk is paid off. Long-range bomber sorties out of Russia into Syria and back. They're not hitting all targets I think that are all that important, but they're demonstrating a capability to do strategic bombing. Where have they struggled? The Kuznetsov is on the slide there for a reason. It struggled to get to Syria. It finally made it to Syria. It lost 2 aircraft in the first week or so of operations when they really were just practicing getting on and off the ship. The black Russian military is great for black humor. The joke in the Russian military was that Kuznetsov killed more Russian airplanes than the Turks did, because the Turkey shot down 1, the Kuznetsov lost 2. They eventually put the carrier wing ashore and just flew from the ground, which made the carrier kind of redundant. Precision munitions have been a shortcoming. They don't use many of them in Syria, and those that they do use are imprecise by our standards. And then amphibious landing. What have they gotten better at? Well, they've gotten a lot better at managing a coalition, I would argue, right? So we look at the coalition the Russians are managing and say it's jihadist groups and the Syrian regime and a bunch of I won't use the word deplorable, but that's where I was going to say anyway. A bunch of people that we would not want to be allied with. Nevertheless, it's given them a lot of experience in managing a very diverse coalition with partners and allies that have sometimes conflicting goals, or goals that don't always align, at least. Employment of remotely piloted aircraft, precision strike with non-precision munitions. They've gotten fairly good at using dumb bombs, but putting them in fairly small places. Still, though, these are shortcomings vis-a-vis, I think, most Western militaries. Okay, and I'll end with this. So this is where I think we are now, and what I think the kind of the major bones of contention are left between Russia and its allies, and Russia and the United States and Syria. The first is still Atanf. Atanf is a thorn in the Russian side and the Syrian side. They don't want us there. On the map, it's the green kind of circle with two little bubbles at the top of it in southeastern Syria along the Iraqi and Jordanian borders. The Russians, again, Atanf was the original reason for the establishment of a ground deconfliction capability in Syria, a Russian threat to our forces there. They would like us out of there. Their argument is Syria is a sovereign country. It should get to control its own borders. And it has borders with both Iraq and Jordan there. The problem with Atanf, at least from the Western perspective, I think, is it also protects the Rukban IDP camp. So there's an internally displaced persons camp there with somewhere in the 60 to 65,000 range of people. I think there's a fear that if the U.S. withdrew its forces from Atanf, and the reason that circle looks like it does is there's a 55-kilometer security zone where no Russian or regime aircraft or ground forces are allowed in. I think the fear is that if the U.S. withdraws from Atanf, the Russians and the regime claim that there are fighters in the Rukban IDP camp and terrorists, and I think what would probably happen is an operation to liquidate the Rukban IDP camp. That would be fairly indiscriminate, imprecise, and a whole lot of, there probably are some fighters there. I'm not sure we know. It's likely that there are, but there are tens of thousands of civilians and many of them would also be victims of an operation by the Russians and the regime to end the camp. So that's one area. The second is Idlib, which everybody's been following. That's in the northwest there. I think this has exposed a bit of a rift between Russia and Turkey that Russia just really doesn't need right now. They had managed to be fairly effective in getting Turkey on side and keeping them on side, even though it's a NATO ally. Turkey's a participant in the Astana process, which is a separate peace process designed to kind of shut the U.S. and the UN out of the final settlement in Syria. So Idlib is somewhere where Turkey and Russia have very different ideas of what should happen. I think if the Russian military and the Syrian regime had their way, there would be an operation in Idlib. It would be very indiscriminate. There are a lot of fighters in Idlib because a lot of the places that the Russian military and the Syrian regime have been reducing around the country over the past year or two, eastern Aleppo, Dara, and all these other places. They've been allowing fighters to, establishing corridors and allowing fighters to leave and go to Idlib. So they're all concentrated there. And now they have to deal with them. They can't deal with them the way they would like to because of the Turkey card, and Turkey is present on the ground outside of, around the borders of Idlib province. So that's a problem they have to deal with. The Russia-Israel relationship, I think, is another one that Russia can't afford to have problems with both Turkey and Israel at the same time, which is, I think, why at least Putin's initial rhetoric to the shoot-down of the IL-20, after he talked to Netanyahu, he called it a tragic series of consequences and no one's fault. What's interesting to me is his military has continued to be very aggressive in their rhetoric. And so I'm wondering, are we seeing possibly a rift between what the Kremlin wants and what the Ministry of Defense or the General Staff want? Something that bears watching. But Russia can't afford a conflict with Israel. Israel and Russia have a deconfliction line in the same way that the U.S. and Russia do. And it's worked fairly well up until the IL-20 shoot-down. And then the final thing, and I'll end here, is this big yellow area in the northeastern part of the country is all controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces. And there are, as Michael said in his intro, 2,000 U.S. forces up there that are embedded with them, supporting them, training them, advising them. Now that the U.S. has said we're going to remain in Syria, not only after the defeat of ISIS, but we're going to remain to ensure that ISIS doesn't regenerate, that's a problem for Russia and the Syrian regime, because their hope was that they could either peel the SDF off from the United States by making the argument that the U.S. is not reliable and we're going to leave, and they're going to leave you in the lurch, so you may as well partner with us. And they have been trying to do that for a year or so. Or that if the U.S. left, the SDF wouldn't have the willpower and the combat power to resist a regime drive into northeastern Syria supported by Russia. That's now off the table. So that's another problem that they're going to have to deal with. And I'll end it there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Next speaker is Steve Zaloga, who's going to be talking about the S-300 surface-to-air missile system, just to provide some context and insight to the capabilities of this system and what it really consists of. So we'll be bringing up the slide presentation in a moment.
And thanks to Mike and the Institute for inviting me. My presentation is going to be a little bit different, a little bit more on the technical side. I'm going to try to avoid making it too technical. I don't think the audience is that interested in the real nitty-gritty, but I'd like to show some of the technical points that may have broader implications on these issues that we're talking about. Let's see, forward is this way? Oh, there we go. Okay, let me go back. One little technical point. The system we're talking about is called S-300. S-300 started in 1968 when the Soviet General Staff put in a requirement for a new generation of air defense systems. It ended up coming up with actually 3 systems. The S-300P, which is actually what we're talking about, a naval version, the S-300F, and finally an Army version called the S-300V. The only reason I'm raising this is that there's oftentimes some misunderstanding about this, and people confuse S-300P and S-300V, entirely different systems. What we're talking about is the P, the air defense system that is closer to the U.S. Army's Patriot system. I'm going to just run by this very quickly. S-300P first went operational in 1979. Although technically it's very similar to the U.S. Army's Patriot system, its application and mission is very different. It was originally developed as a strategic air defense system, that is a system to defend the major Soviet cities, Moscow, Leningrad, and some of the industrial zones. It went through continual evolution, as you can see there. The system that we're talking about at the moment is the last of them, the S-300P MU2, sometimes known by its export name Favorite. To make another point, S-300P or PMU2 or whatever we're talking about is not simply one discrete item. It's a package. When somebody goes and buys one of these things, it's a package that can include various types of components. And so when discussing it, there's one thing about a system that's bought, for example, by China at a very high cost and a system that's bought by Syria which may end up being a very low-cost system, and I'll get into some of the more specific details. What Syria appears to be getting at the moment, if you look down in the lower right-hand corner, they're getting the semi-trailer version of it rather than the self-propelled version of it. It's a somewhat less expensive system. I'm going to throw this up just quickly. This is a Russian ad from the company that manufactures the S-300. As I say, the export name is Favorite. That gives some of the basic specifications. This is basically designed as a very long-range air defense system. This is designed to protect strategic targets, capitals, significant military objectives. It's not really designed for forward tactical deployment to protect, say, Army units. One interesting thing about Favorite is that the Russians, when they first started to market it, they were offering it with two different missiles. The older 200-kilometer range missile, the larger one that's shown down in the inset drawing, and a new smaller missile that's designed to provide more capability at close range against certain types of targets like cruise missiles. Syria is probably just going to get the big one. They're probably not going to get the small one. But at this moment, the details are just not there. But I was going to point that out because we're not, when we're talking about S-300P, we're not talking just one missile, one type of system. We're talking about a menu of items. Getting into this whole idea, this is also an ad from one of the Russian brochures, and it shows the basic components that you need to operate an S-300 system. You need a command vehicle in the upper left. You need a long-range radar vehicle in the lower left. You need the absolute critical element is that radar that's in the upper center, sometimes known by its NATO code name Flaplid. That's the fire control radar. Without that, nothing works. Below that is the system that probably most people think of when they think of a missile system. It's the launcher system. It has 4 launch tubes on the back end. It either comes in the version shown here, which is self-propelled, or the towed one that I showed in the earlier drawing. Folks who are buying a more full-up system have various options, better and more complete radar systems to provide a better sensor network. And one interesting piece that they sometimes buy is that elevated fire control tower that I'm showing there. The reason that that's critical is that if you're in a mountainous country, say like Syria, you need to elevate your radars up to get over the hilly areas, otherwise you can't see anything. The inset drawing down at the bottom shows the standard organization of an S-300 regiment of the type that was sold to the Warsaw Pact back in the late 1980s. So it's kind of a standard export configuration. The Russian units are somewhat different. What it looks like Syria is getting at the moment is one of the fire control radars, the flap lid that's shown up above it, and one fire battery which has 4 launcher vehicles. So it's not a full-up regiment of this sort. It's not clear yet if it's getting any of the additional radars or whether they're going to net into what Syria already has. It looks at the moment like they're getting a very limited token capability. They're going to have S-300, but they're not necessarily going to have a full S-300 package. Now, that could change next year, could change next month. But at the moment, it seems to be very, very limited. I'm going to just throw up the tech specs. The ones that will be of interest, the radar in the system has a detection range of 300 kilometers, very dependent on where the radars are. If you put the radars down in a valley, it's not going to see very far. Throw up on top of a mountain, you'll see a lot better. The missile has a maximum range, and I emphasize the word maximum, 200 kilometers. That doesn't mean that it's effective out at 200 kilometers. This also gives some sense of the capability to engage various type of targets. I'm not going to get into that. That gets into the technical weeds. This is probably the most important point. Russian air defense systems are designed to operate as part of an integrated air defense system. They're not really designed, you don't go and buy them, stick it up, and expect you're going to be able to defend your country with one little S-300 battery. If you don't have an S-300 battery integrated, you lose all those sensors and command and control items, and it ends up not being very effective. To make the point, if you look at that red arrow sort of in the center, there's the S-300. This is an illustration that the Russians put together for a 1999 conference that was given down in the Middle East where they were trying to sell various types of air defense equipment. But it gives you some sense of the complexity of it. It's a network of systems and systems, sensor systems to detect the targets, various type of air defense missile systems like S-300, but also including short-range systems, And finally, command and control. You take the sensor data in, you understand what it means, then you engage with your missiles. If you don't have that, it just doesn't work very well. And the point is, at the moment, Syria's package, its integrated air defense system, is probably its weakest point. And the shoot down of the IL-20 makes that very, very evident. That was clearly a command and control issue, a failure of the Syrian integrated air defense system. Putting the S-300 in doesn't solve that problem. It's another nice tool to have if you've got an air defense system, but it doesn't solve the problem. This is getting really techy, but it's an important point that has to be understood. This is actually a technical illustration showing the effective range of the early S-300P system using the earlier missiles, but it still makes the point. The top one is the elevation, the bottom one is the azimuth coverage of these missile systems. When they say maximum range, in this case, the maximum range for 5E55R was 75 kilometers, so you see the bubble going out to 55 kilometers. That's the maximum range. That's against a high slow target. That's basically if you're shooting at a sitting duck. You know, if you're shooting at an IL-20 or you're shooting at an airliner, you can get the missile out to the outer edge of that boundary. But if you're shooting at a low-flying cruise missile that's coming in nap of the earth, you're not going to be able to hit out that far. So you see there's a dead zone underneath that bubble. That's where the radar can't see. And part of that is just the nature of geography. It's basically the radar horizon imposed by the nature of radars. But beyond that, I've also put on here, you'll see a red dot and then some green arrows down there. The other issue is that you not only have a limit with how far your radar can see out, and you need the radar to guide the missile, you have what's called cycle time. You know, when do you first see the target? When can you first engage it? When do you decide to engage it? When do you launch your missile? How long does it take the missile to get out there and hit the target? So instead of this wonderful 75-kilometer range that's shown in the outer part of the bubble, in reality, these missile systems are really effective at a much shorter range. And I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritty of what ranges we're talking about, but that's something to keep in the back of your mind. So when people start saying, S-300, it's going to give the Syrians the capability to strike out at 200 kilometers, it will against certain high and slow targets. For example, if there's a drone, a Reaper, or a Global Hawk just loitering out in the Med or whatever, yeah, those type of systems are vulnerable. But for fast-moving tactical fighter aircraft firing guided weapons, the engagement range is going to be very, very, very short. On that map of Syria, I went and stuck the 200-kilometer maximum range. And I also put a smaller circle in the center showing where the radar horizon is. Syria has a real problem with air defense systems because the country is so mountainous. So when you go and stick an air defense unit down in a valley, suddenly the radar horizon shortens and shortens and shortens because the terrain interferes with the radar's vision. So that's why I mentioned a moment ago there's some technical issues. You know, do you get a radar on a mast to get around some of those problems? Do you buy additional radars to give yourself some views beyond the geographic horizon? I just want to emphasize this point. Just because the newspapers are going to say that the S-300 can cover that area, theoretically, yes, against some soft targets, but in reality, no. This I'm going to throw up. This is the best public knowledge about what the Syrians had been thinking about S-300 back in the old days. The Syrians have been trying to buy S-300P for a couple of decades. They approached the former Soviet Union, now Russia, 1990 through 95 at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And on the left-hand side, you see what the requirements were. They wanted 12 fire units, but you'll see that they wanted a bunch of other stuff too. That other stuff is the essential little ingredients that you need for an integrated air defense network. You not only need that missile system, you need the radars, you need the command and control stuff. Now, what we can see them buying now is only a little tiny fraction of that. It's a little chunk of the missile systems. You can also see what the Russians offered them, what the Soviet General Staff recommended they should be buying rather than what they wanted to buy. And that was, you'll see that they only wanted to sell them 6 PMU, 6 S-300 fire units, but they wanted to sell them 6 Book. Book is the system that the Syrians are already operating. It's a tactical air defense system. the Russians immediately knew that S-300 is more of a prestige system. You know, it's a system for strategic air defense of major capital areas. But for tactical air defense, a system like Buk or Pantsir is much, much more effective for a lot of the issues that the Syrians face. So that's what the Russians countered the offer. But regardless of that, Syrians had no money. They owed the Russians billions and billions of dollars. So for a decade or so, nothing, there were no transfers to Syria. Now, of course, in the past several years, the political situation has changed, and they have changed their mind and are supplying the equipment.
They still don't have money, I think.
They still don't have money, which is one of the reasons probably why they're getting basically token capability. What the Russians seems to be transferring at the moment, a single fire unit, is not the kind of thing that chart, this chart here. This isn't what they're getting now. They're getting something of much, much, much smaller fraction of that. I'm throwing this up just because this sometimes comes out in the discussion, the Syrians want S-400. The issue is that S-300 PMU-2 isn't in production anymore. It ended production in 2011. So what the Syrians are probably getting are some reconditioned units from the Russian armed forces, from the Strategic Air Defense Forces, or they're getting bits and pieces. They're getting some reconditioned equipment. The missiles are still in production because the missiles are still used by the S-400 system. So they're probably getting some mix of new and old equipment. The follow-on to S-300 PMU is an evolution of it called S-400. It's been on the export market for a while. China's already bought it. It's apparently going over to India soon. There was an announcement about a week ago that India is going to purchase it. It's on offer to a variety of people. Turkey, as you know, there's the issue with the Turkish purchase of S-400. So this is the follow-on to S-300. The Syrians said they wanted it, but the problem is when the Russians have been selling S-300, they've been selling it at the 2004 prices because, as I say, the system's out of production. S-400 is being sold at 2018 prices. So it's an extremely expensive system. And the capability, although it's certainly better than S-300 PMU-2, it's simply a matter of cost, whether the Russians are willing to accept that burden. And with that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Steve. Thanks. I'd like to kick off the Q&A with just a couple of questions, a question to each of the speakers, and then we'll open up to Q&A from the audience. First, let me start with Anna. Could you discuss a little bit about the Russian-Iranian relationship? About a year or two, there was kind of a cottage industry in D.C. kind of discussing how, if it's at all possible, to drive a wedge between the Russians and the Iranians. So I'd like you to discuss that a little bit and tell us what opportunities or limitations there might be, given that, now we've adopted as our policy goal getting the Iranians and their proxies out of Syria. But, from the Russian point of view, their big accomplishment is ensuring the survival of the Assad regime, and that's not going to happen unless the Russians are willing to go in on the ground, which I don't see any indication. That's not going to happen. The regime can only stay there if the Iranians and their proxies remain. So we're basically now we're ensconced with the Russians militarily, pursuing contradictory objectives there. So how do you see this playing out? If you could give us a little kind of background in terms of how we got to where we are and how you see things going in the future. Bob, if you could talk to us a little about deconfliction and tell us, how do you posture yourself to ensure the success of the deconfliction efforts? In other words, I assume deconfliction, in a way, based on your monograph, it's a kind of it's a quasi-diplomatic process. I mean, that entails leverage and credibility and reputation. So how do you posture yourself within Syria in order to ensure that you achieve your goals vis-a-vis the Russians in this deconfliction relationship? And do you see a linkage between Russian behavior in Syria and developments elsewhere in the world? In other words, would they sometimes act out in Syria because of things going on elsewhere in the world? Or do you see a linkage of that sort also? And then, Steve, with regard to the S-300 system, could you speak a little bit more about the difference between the Russian version of the S-300 and the ones they export? And bottom line, what are the main differences, and what does it mean in terms of the effectiveness of the system? And how much does, one of the things the advertising points with this missile is that it's highly automated. So does that compensate for perhaps less well-trained personnel or people with, you're dealing with kind of people who have perhaps less of a educational baseline than the average kind of Russians manning this. Can automation compensate or not? And then one last thing, if you could talk a little about IFF procedures. Does the COOT have IFF, kind of systems it should have been on, and what does that tell us about the degree of integration between the Russians and the Syrians, at least until now? So full plate there. Anna, when you start.
Sure, Mike, thank you. So Russia and Iran, how we got here and where we're going. Russia and Iran have a very complicated relationship that goes back 500 years. These are historic rivals. And the countries fought 2 wars in the 19th century, both of which Iran lost to Russia and ceded territory to the Russian Empire. So Iran has a long history of distrust towards Russia. At the same time, what brought them together was their joint anti-Americanism, their desire to drive the United States and its allies out of the Middle East. And it's a common interest that continues to bind them together. They've been very successful at putting their differences aside, and the differences exist, but the overarching goal is the same. And while there's been a lot of discussion, as you mentioned, Mike, about driving a wedge between Russia and Iran, I tend to be skeptical that that it would be easy to split Russia from Iran, and that furthermore Russia really has a lot of leverage over Iran. In other words, even if Russia wanted to exert more pressure, I'm not exactly sure where that might come from. You can foresee them, stalling more weapons sales. So certainly that's something that Iran always coveted from Russia, and Russia sends a lot of weapons to Iran. We've seen that with the S-300 sale that was frozen for several years, and that Russia eventually revived. But beyond that, I'm skeptical that that wedge can really be driven for as long as common interests bind them together. And again, I don't think the Iranian regime likes everything that the Russian government does. Certainly, I've heard that they would prefer that Russia wouldn't have as good relations with Israel as it does, but now the situation is different, at least in the short term. But at the same time, they also don't have a lot of a choice. It's a fairly isolated regime as well. So I think, in my view, at least the best way forward is to be for the United States to be more assertive in the region rather than try to see if we can drive a wedge between them.
Thank you.
Okay. So, Mike, you asked about how to posture to ensure the success of the deconfliction efforts, and you mentioned specifically leverage, credibility, and reputation, which I thought were. So I'll kind of frame my remarks around those. I think that's a good way to think about it. So one thing Russia is aware of in its relationship with the United States-led coalition in Syria is that Russia has higher order goals at stake in Syria, but has less power over Syria and on the ground in Syria. In other words, less overall military capability deployed by the Russians, but their security interests in Syria are higher order, I think, than ours are. So what that leads them to do is they're willing to run higher risks than we would run to try to even that balance out, right? And so we call it escalate to de-escalate. They will intentionally escalate a situation by engaging in things that we consider very provocative, dangerous behavior in order to force a conversation with the United States, force a meeting, force a deconfliction agreement to be adjusted in their favor. And they run risks that, frankly, I don't think we would run. And it's a way for them to even out the balance and to compensate for the fact that although Syria matters more to them, they have less military capability deployed there. So that, I think, is how they kind of maintain some leverage, protect that the credibility and the reputation. For us, it really goes to our relationship with the Syrian Democratic Forces, with our partner force. And one way the Russians escalate to de-escalate is striking what we used to call dirt strikes in front of the SDF. As the SDF is moving, the Russian Air Force would come in and they would drop bombs right in front of them. A couple of times they either intentionally or unintentionally actually hit the SDF. The reason that's so risky, so it's risky to us, to the United States, because it puts us in the position of having to decide what kind of airplane it is it Syrian or is it Russian, and what risk we're willing to take to protect our partner force. And the Russians know, as does the Syrian regime, that there are U.S. advisors embedded with the partner force. So it gets very risky if U.S. advisors are killed or injured. I think the events of February 7th were when the Wagner Group attack on what was it was an SDF headquarters. And like I said, they launched out of their little box east of the Euphrates River, south of the city of Deir ez-Zor, and they came toward the U.S. partner force where U.S. advisors were embedded. And the guy who was my successor at the deconfliction cell, I was already gone by then. They communicated very clearly to the Russians, we'll defend this force. And so I think that was a test, and I think they used the Wagner Group because there's some deniability there. It wasn't Russian military, and the Russians could say, and they did say, not our people. And so we have no control over these guys. But I think that test, one, it went a long way toward establishing U.S. credibility to defend its forces and the forces of its partners in eastern Syria. It also, I think, was useful in a way for the Russian military by letting them know that we would strike, and we would strike with a lot of force and a lot of power, and be willing to create a lot of casualties on their side, understanding that it was a not Russian military, it was a contractor, a mercenary force. Nevertheless, I think had the U.S. not reacted the way it did, that would have been a signal to the Russians that eastern Syria is mostly open. It's just a matter of time, and we can do what we need to do there. The final part of your question, Mike, about linkage between Syria and elsewhere, sure. I think the Russian military, and I think the government in general, is very instrumental, transactional, unemotional about these things, and where they see leverage, they will exploit it if they need to. The most obvious analog to Syria, I think, is Ukraine, although the roles are reversed, right? Where, in their minds, I think where they're supporting the legitimate government in Syria and we're supporting an insurgency in Ukraine. Again, the Russian government doesn't acknowledge it being in Ukraine, but they acknowledge they're supporting an insurgency. They just don't acknowledge there are forces in Ukraine doing it. And we're supporting what we consider the legitimate government. They consider an unelected junta. Nevertheless, there's an obvious analog there. A less obvious analog, but I think we're starting to see Russia try to undermine the U.S. and exert some leverage, is in their outreach to the Taliban in Afghanistan. And General Nicholson, before he left, said publicly, we know this. We know that the Russian Federation is not only talking to the Taliban, but also arming them, supplying them in northern Afghanistan. And that may just be a way to cause problems for the United States and just undermine a U.S. effort there. So I do think, there's in their minds there is linkage, and they'll use it when they need to, but they have to be careful, and they always are, I think, fairly careful not to escalate somewhere else to a point that makes them more vulnerable in Syria if we choose to respond by escalating in Syria. Thank you.
Steve?
Starting off with the issue of IFF, because it relates pretty strongly to the IL-20 shootdown, let me just give a brief explanation. IFF is identification, friend or foe. It's fairly similar in the military world to transponders on civil airliners. If there's an airliner flying out of Dulles, it's going to have a little device on the aircraft so that when air traffic control radar sweeps it, it pings back and it says, I'm United Airlines Flight 607, here I am. And the military system works the same way. There's something on the aircraft that transponds or that talks with the air defense radars so that friendly forces know that that aircraft that's out there is friendly. They're sending back a little signal saying, I'm friendly, don't shoot at me. There's two issues here. One issue that Mike raised was, are the Russian IFF versus what they're selling to the Syrians? The answer is the Russians, whenever they sell an air defense system or other type systems that have IFF embedded in them, they always sell something different to the export client. That's not unusual. The U.S. does the same thing with its clients. It's simply that you want to keep your own IFF signals to yourself for a variety of security reasons. They don't necessarily sell a downgraded IFF, but they sell something that's a little bit different. Personally, I don't think that IFF was the issue with the IL-20 shootdown. This strikes me as being a far more profound collapse of their situational awareness, their air defense capabilities. The Syrian so-called integrated air defense network is very old. Their radars are extremely old. They're broken down. The Russians have been trying over the past 3 or 4 years to repair a lot of this stuff. If you operate your radars 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, they wear out. And most of this stuff is really old. We're talking 30-year-old radars. I suspect there's enormous holes in the radars. The radars are not up all the time. The network itself, the Syrians seldom have real situational awareness of what's going on in their airspace. And so events like the shootdown of the IL-20 are largely a result of this collapse of their air defense network. I don't think it's a simple technical issue of the IFF failing. The IFF should have told the Syrian operators that's a friendly Russian aircraft out there, don't shoot at us. But they probably got confused. Usually what happens is that at national level you have somebody who's in charge of the air situation report. You have it, because Syria is not a very big country, you have one command center that will say, we're controlling this. Perhaps they lost control. Perhaps they put it down to some type of a regional air defense control and they just lost control of things. I don't know the details.
Would a reconnaissance flight not operate with this IFF because of for operational security reasons?
There should have been two reasons that even if let's just for a moment pretend that the IFF failed. I don't think that they would have operated without IFF. They may have operated with some different IFF. But even if they didn't operate with an IFF, the Syrians should have understood that that was a friendly aircraft. It didn't have the characteristics of a threat. Yeah. It's not a fast-moving, low-altitude profile. It's just sitting out there wandering around in a circle. So it's not an F-16 coming in on the deck. So they should have understood that what they're dealing with there is not a threatening target. Then on top of it, I suspect the transponder probably was working and either their IFF gear wasn't working properly. It was probably a sequence of things. It probably wasn't one thing, but it reflects the severe weakness that the Syrians have as far as situational awareness in their air defense environment. And that's not going to be easy to fix. Buying the S-300 is not going to solve that. The S-300 is just a system that would plug into that would help them, give them a little bit more range and give them a little bit of stuff. But without that broader network, it's, as I say, it's a token capability. It's a prestige weapon. It's nice to say, we have S-300P, but it doesn't do an awful lot for them. Now, getting back to the issue of automation, the Russian air defense systems generally are less expensive than Western systems, whether you're dealing with Patriot or French systems or whatever. They tend to be less expensive. They tend to require more manpower. They have just traditionally been fairly manpower intensive. Neutral clients, for lack of a better term, countries like India have complained about that for a long time, that when they look at the Western systems that they buy versus the Russian systems traditionally take larger crews. The Russians, in the evolution of S-300, from S-300 up to S-400, understand that. They've had the Chinese complain, they've had the Indians complain, they've had some of their good clients complain. S-400 is an effort to reduce the manpower footprint of the regiment. But the Syrians can't afford it, and I don't think the Russians want to sell it to them anyways. So going to a more automated, more digital, better system, of course, the Syrians, they would love to have it, but it's really expensive. And whether the Russians are willing to basically give it to them, that's an open question. The Syrians just need tons of stuff. For them to put together a really good. And let me back up for a second. The Syrian system is not terrible in a lot of the developing world, but when they're facing threats, first of all, the Israelis really know what they're doing. The Israeli Air Force is has very sophisticated strike capabilities. So Syria faces a country, a threat that really knows what they're doing. And then secondly, if you throw in the United States, and the United States decides to launch a threat, the U.S. has even more capability as far as what threats it can throw into the Syrian air defense network. So Syria is, to begin with, a fairly weak network. But then when faced with the people who they are faced with, it's doubly difficult because they're facing the best. So you have a system that's weak to begin with, and then you're facing a very serious threat.
And the export version versus Russian version, and I ask because some of the film footage shown on Russian TV showed actually a self-propelled version of the S-300 coming off the Antonov transport versus the semi-trailer. Would they mix and match, put some of the older missiles in a newer TEL? Is that possible?
The issue of what kind of TEL they have really doesn't matter. The film footage I saw, part of the problem is when you see film footage on TV, you don't really know what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
You don't know if you're dealing with stock footage or the real thing. The stuff that I saw where Russian television claimed that it was really the airplane delivering it showed the trailer version, but the flap lid, the radar vehicle was on the self-propelled, on the MAS 543 chassis. But the launch vehicles were the semi-trailer. It doesn't matter. They both operate the same way. Technically, they're very similar. The truck-based one is generally less mobile in the sense that if you're in an environment where you don't need to move it around, you're not trying to shoot and scoot, you go and you park the semi-trailer and you just leave it there. The self-propelled one does allow you to move around a bit in case you are threatened. Both of them can move. It's just a matter of a few minutes difference as far as picking it up or not. These are not mobile systems in the usual sense of the word. It's not like a mobile artillery system where if you're threatened, it takes you 30 minutes and you're out of there. An air defense system like this takes hours upon hours to set up and get operating and then net into everybody else. So it's mobile is only mobile in a limited sense of the word.
Thank you very much. We'll take questions now. I got Mike Kraft, and just raise your finger and I'll make a list now. So I've got okay. So right over here we have. Thank you. I got you over there. Okay.
Thanks very much. An excellent presentation. Mike Kraft, I'm a counterterrorism specialist in former State Department. And I have a question about the Russian bombing campaign. By most accounts, it seemed to be rather indiscriminate. I've seen video footage of it almost looked like World War II type carpet bombing. Why were they so heavy-handed, engaging in this sort of widespread bombing as opposed to more tactical pinpoint bombing? Colonel Hamilton, I think you said they didn't have much in the way of smart bombs. And there's some speculation that one reason they may have been doing this is to encourage the flow of refugees to destabilize Turkey, Jordan, and also into Europe. I wonder if you think there's anything to that. But basically trying to get at why do they seem to be so heavy-handed? And kind of parallel to this, they were doing a lot of propaganda against the white helmets, calling them terrorists, and claiming the U.S. was supporting ISIS. I saw a lot of this on the internet before the elections here. I haven't seen too much lately, but are they still carrying on that campaign?
Okay. Thank you.
Sure, I'll start. So why were the Russians so heavy-handed? I think there's two reasons. I certainly think the refugee part of efforts to increase refugee flows were a big part of it. Look, from the Russian official perspective, everybody who was fighting Assad was a terrorist. There's certainly several reasons for doing this. When you have such a heavy-handed campaign, this is basically a Chechnya-style campaign. You help demoralize the population. In a way, when you think about what does chemical weapons attacks? Well, that also tends to demoralize. So, when you increase fears in the general population, that really matters. I'm also skeptical that even if the Russians wanted to have a more targeted campaign, that they would be really able to do it on the level that we do it. I'm not sure if they're sophisticated enough, and I would leave that to Robert to answer. And as far as the question about the white helmets, there was definitely there was a major propaganda effort, exactly as you say. I haven't seen as much of that, but I think they drove that in anticipation of a possible chemical attack, in anticipation of preemptively sort of creating a narrative to protect Assad if he resorted to chemical weapons.
And yeah, I would agree with Anna that so they're willing to pay whatever reputational costs they may have to pay in order to reduce these opposition strongholds, which they've been very successful at doing, really. I mean, starting the first major one, at least that I was kind of part of watching, was Eastern Aleppo in the summer of 2016, and then they've moved, the last one left, really, is Idlib, and that's where they funneled all these guys to. So you know, the technique has been to surround these places on the ground, to cut off humanitarian aid, and then to bomb them fairly indiscriminately until the people there, the fighters there, agree to leave. And so that's allowed them to shrink the opposition-controlled territory in west of the Euphrates and south of the Euphrates, really to just Idlib, and then Atanf, which is only being protected by the United States. So, and their disinformation campaigns have been fairly effective. My first foray into dealing with the Russians over Syria was in Geneva in the summer of 2016 when we were co-chairing the Syria support group, and we would meet with them twice a day at the UN. And every day they would they would accuse us of a dozen things, all of which were false. But it backfoots the United States because some of these things, and we would have to go back and do what I would call truth triage. Like, okay, they accused us of these 12 things today. These 3 are so egregious that we have to respond to them. And so we would spend hours putting together papers and packets to bring back down to the UN at the next meeting with the Russians to prove to them that we had not done what they said we did. In the meantime, they're already two steps ahead of us, and they hand us the newest list of accusations, right? And so this is all the while they're bombing eastern Aleppo indiscriminately, maintaining there is no operation. I had the surreal experience of sitting across from a Russian general and hearing him say, no, there's no operation going on in eastern Aleppo. We're watching the bombs fall out of the sky and hit hospitals and schools and civilian buildings and everything. So I think they do it, one, because as Anna said, they would struggle to be as precise as they would need to be, and 2, it's effective. It's effective. I mean, you know, they're unemotional, I think, about these things and about Syria. And in fact, they would at times tell us to stop being so emotional when we would bring up, you know, cases of what we considered indiscriminate bombing. And there's also this idea, you mentioned this, Anna, every young male with a beard and a gun is a terrorist. It doesn't matter. In the summer of 2016, they were bombing groups that were backed by the U.S. and were signatories to the cessation of hostilities. So these are COH signatory groups who said, we will lay our arms down, we'll abide by the COH, and the Russians and the regime were bombing them because in their minds, they're all either terrorists or potential terrorists, right? Future terrorists. And so they don't discriminate among ISIS, what at the time was still calling itself Jabhat al-Nusra, and all the myriad of groups that are in Syria, maybe fighting the regime for different reasons, but they're Sunni and they're armed. Therefore, they're terrorists.
Actually, if I could add just very quickly also on that point, one Russian former military officer who served in Chechnya, who's pretty well known right now, recalls his experience in Chechnya in the first Chechnya war. He was told that any Chechen male between the age of 10 and 65 was a fair target. Now, these were Russian-owned citizens. And if the Russian government felt comfortable enough bombing their own citizens, imagine how they feel about a different country.
Just before we go on, just one quick point about precision. My understanding is that the Russians supposedly have used about 80% dumb bombs versus 20% precision. The precision munitions supposedly haven't worked, aren't on the level of ours. But keep in mind, you could actually, if you have a precision platform, you could actually deliver dumb bombs pretty accurately. And I'll just mention the Israeli raid on Osirak in 1981, which was involving smart platforms or precision platforms and dumb bombs on the Osirak reactor. So they've actually done pretty well with the dumb bombs they've been dropping. Steve, you want to add?
The problem is that the Russian Air Force does have real limitations in conducting precision airstrikes. If you go to a Russian air show like the one they hold in Zhukovsky every couple years, you'll see the panoply of modern precision-guided munitions, laser-guided bombs, GPS-guided bombs, the usual sort of stuff. But if you look at the Russian aircraft, they don't have the sensor pods, they don't have the laser designators. Their Air Force is stuck somewhat akin to where the U.S. Air Force was during the Vietnam War as far as precision strike. They have some limited capability to do laser-guided bombs. They have some precision platforms that allow them to use dumb bombs. But you have to remember that the Russian Air Force didn't get a lot of money from about 1990 till a couple years ago. So for a couple decades, when all this precision-guided revolution was happening, they didn't have any money. So yes, Russian industry can produce these things, but the problem is they just haven't bought them. So the inventory of precision weapons just isn't there. The issue of policy, whether they want to use them, isn't a significant issue too. But they do not have a large inventory of either the aircraft that are prepared to use the weapons or the weapons themselves.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. Please identify yourselves.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Sylwia Szafrowska from the Polish Embassy. Thank you for fantastic briefings. Two quick questions. The first one with regard to the deconfliction mechanism. Where is Israel and Turkey in it? Do you talk somehow to them and what it looks like? And also to deconfliction mechanism, how do Russians protect Iranian fighters if they do it at all? And the second question is, what's the future of Russian military presence, in your opinion, in terms of troops and equipment in next year or 2 years perspective? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll take the deconfliction ones, then the third one's really hard, so I'll leave that for someone else. So the question was, does the United States talk to Israel and Turkey? Right. So we do not formally in the ground deconfliction cell that we have at our headquarters. The higher headquarters does. In fact, we have Turkish officers in the headquarters of the Combined Joint Task Force Inherent Resolve. They are involved in most, but not all, of the discussions. Just due to classification, there's some things that only certain allies are classified or allowed to receive. So we have, and I know the Air Operations Center in Qatar also has Turkish officers there that sit on the floor, sit on the Operations Center floor. Not literally sit on the floor. We don't make them sit on the floor. They have desks like everyone else. I assume that the air deconfliction mission is better linked in with Israel than we were on the ground side, because the Israelis, the things they were doing and the places they were operating in Syria had no impact really on what we were concerned about. We, in the ground side, were and remain concerned and focused on what we call the MERV, the Middle Euphrates River Valley, basically from Raqqa all the way down to the Iraq border, because that's where U.S. and Russian forces kind of came together. So yeah, we had a formal relationship on the ground side with Turkey. That mostly revolved around places in the north, like Manbij, where for a long time there was a U.S. presence in Manbij that was really just to deter Turkey from attacking it. Now there are joint U.S.-Turkish patrols in Manbij, so that's a Kurdish enclave in kind of the far north and northwest. Afrin. The Kurdish enclave in the northwest, when Turkey started their military operation there this spring, I guess. I wasn't there, but I know there were a lot of very serious conversations between the U.S. and Turkey about making sure that the Afrin operation didn't go too far. And I know the SDF, our partner force, pulled some of its forces out of southeastern Syria, where they were fighting ISIS, to go to Afrin to help defend Afrin. So that was, I would imagine, that was a fairly tense time with Turkey. So our interactions with Turkey on the ground were more robust than they were with Israel, obviously. But there was no formal deconfliction mission like we had with the Russians, mostly because the Turks were embedded in our headquarters. Right, we had day-to-day contact with the Turkish military.
Anybody else wanted to?
You left the easy ones for me.
Future Russian presence was the
Future Russian, sure. Look, I don't have a crystal ball. I think the fact that Russia has ensured a military presence legally for at least the next 49 years tells you that they're there to stay in some capacity. And that's both in the Tartus base and the Khmeimim base. Beyond that, I think we'll just have to wait and see. But the message is that they're there to stay. I think that's a pretty clear message.
Okay.
I think that all depends on how the events are going to play out. I mean, that's what it comes down to. For example, the S-300 situation happened after the Ilyushin incident. So, if there are more incidents, maybe there'll be more of an
And keep in mind also I think the dispatch of the S-400s happened after the shoot down of the Sukhoi 24 by the Turks. So in the past, at least until now, it's been linked to kind of, to incidents. Now, there might be a natural build-up process after this, but thus far it's been linked to incidents, so that's kind of interesting, just data point. So,
Yeah, and just as Putin has already twice announced the withdrawal of Russian forces from Syria, right, which he keeps announcing withdrawals, and then what they really are is just rotations.
Right.
At some point, I think he's not going to be able to announce any more withdrawals when their presence there stays about the same, but it is interesting to watch.
okay, so we have just a few minutes. We have two questioners here, and then why don't you guys piggyback? Each one ask your questions, and then we'll go to. We'll have enough time to get you. Don't worry. So, please.
Herbert Regenbogen. I'm professor for international relations and law at Teal University in Germany. I wanted to ask just two questions. The impact of the new development, it'll be twofold.
Please, very quick.
Impact of the S-500, and the second one is with the new fly zones that are being discussed on the Turkish-Syrian border, what impact would a Patriot missile complex for that defense have on this entire issue of technological defense for the rival parties?
And then Henri, why don't we?
Henri Barkey, Lehigh University. By the way, the patrols on Manbij haven't started yet, and they're not going to start anytime soon. They haven't agreed yet. Anna, what's the purpose of this agreement with the Turks that the Russians have done in Idlib? Because if Idlib was going to be the end game, they were going to get rid of all those jihadis. They had them all in one little pocket. What's the purpose now? Why letting them, some of them go? So I don't understand the strategy behind Idlib. On the S-300, the Greeks have an S-300 system in Crete that the Cypriots had to give to the Greeks. So we have very good knowledge about that is. But what I was curious, having told us about the different types of S-300s, how sophisticated is that S-300 system that the Russians ultimately sold to the Cypriots and went to Greece? Is it really sophisticated? So do we know a lot about the system?
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, we'll do you. We have time for one more question. Yours will be the last. So why don't you guys answer those? Stanley, we'll get to you right in a minute. Don't worry. We'll get you. Yeah. Okay. So please.
I'll just start in the S-500. S-500 isn't even in service yet. S-500 is a Russian development for strategic national air defense protection of Moscow and the major cities. So I'm not quite sure of what you're driving at in relation to Syria. The most sophisticated system that's been offered or that's been available in the area is S-400, which is an evolution of S-300, and it's not significantly different in performance from S-300. Getting to the other question, the sophisticated or the level of what was sold to Cyprus. Cyprus got the S-300 PMU-1s, which is a slightly earlier version of what has just been sold to Syria. It differs in a lot of small respects. It doesn't have that second type of missile that I pointed out there. Command and control is a little bit different, but it's fairly close. It's in the same neighborhood as the S-300 PMU-2. But the Greeks or the Cypriots bought a full-up system. They didn't buy they weren't handed over a little token system like what Syria has at the moment. They got up a full-up system with the associated radars and all the other equipment. Russia knows that. Russia, when it sold it to the Cypriots, knew that all of the NATO countries are going to go to the Greeks and say, can we come down and play with you? Because that's what happens when you sell this stuff. The German Air Force is going to call them up and say, hey, we would like to come down and play with you, and you try shooting at us. So, yes. And then besides that, and this is public knowledge, the U.S. has S-300 systems. The various former Soviet Union republics had a lot of this equipment. Well, guess who goes and buys it? And it's not only the U.S. that's bought it. So the S-300 system is very well understood. You know, the further away you get from the 1991 systems, these newer ones, the new export ones, they do have differences from what the West is probably more familiar with, but it's a reasonably well understood system. I'll just leave it at that.
And the Israelis have exercised in Greece, and presumably with the S-300 there. So, yeah.
Henri, on the Idlib deal, you know, the one thing that strikes me as most interesting is that Sergei Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, was quick to point out that this is an interim deal. And in terms of what they're getting, my understanding is that Assad got access to two critical roads that were important for the Syrian economy, which is, as you know, is not doing very well. There's very many reasons to doubt that this deal is really going to hold, and I suspect that's one reason why Lavrov said it's an interim deal. You know, at the very least, it gives Turkey some breathing room. Certainly stems the flow of refugees into Turkey, at least for now, and that's more of what Turkey got versus what Russia got. So at least at this stage, it probably was not the most advantageous deal to Russia. Assad was not party to this deal, which raises questions again about what is he going to do. So I think this is all very tenuous, and I suspect they realize that.
Yeah, I would just add that any deal with Russia over Syria is an interim deal. All deals are interim. And I say that in all seriousness. I mean, you know, there was about this time last year or a little earlier, there was a lot of fanfare about the Southwest de-escalation zone, right? Which lasted until it was in the Russians and the regime's interest to go and clear the Southwest out. And they launched a deliberate military operation, and now they're all the way on the border with Israel, which, you know, we were in Israel. I was in Israel in April, and the Israeli military said Jaish Khalid bin Walid, which had been down there, they said, we don't like them on our border, but they've left us alone. We will not countenance the regime on our border because with the regime come the Iranians. And now they have that. So it bears watching to see what Israel's response will be. But on Idlib, I think the only thing keeping the operation from starting, honestly, is Turkey. Because Russia can't afford right now to lose both Israel and Turkey. It never had Israel and Turkey on its side in any meaningful sense to begin with, but it had constructive, pragmatic relations with both Israel and Turkey over Syria. Those, you can't have both of those be threatened at the same time. So I think what they've decided to do is put the Idlib issue aside while they focus on the problem with Israel and the shoot down of the IL-20. As soon as that's taken care of, you can expect the operation in Idlib to start. There'll be an operation if they have to figure out how they bring Turkey along or just shut Turkey out. If there will be an operation, it'll be indiscriminate, and thousands of people will die, and some will be fighters, and most probably won't. But that's coming because there's nowhere else to put those people. All those people, most of them, many of them, came from the other opposition-controlled cities that the Russians and the regime surrounded and bombed into submission, and then they let the fighters and some of the civilians out. So now Idlib is the last place, unless they can cut a deal, you know, with another country to export them somewhere. I don't see that.
Good luck with that. Yeah. Stanley, we have the last question. Stanley Cobra back there.
When I look at the situation now, it reminds me of 1914 in Europe. Serbia and Austria thought they'd have a small war. Russia and Germany wouldn't get involved. They were wrong. Everybody thought the other guy would back down. As was just mentioned, the confrontation now is Israel versus Iran. Russia's close to Iran. We're tied to Israel. There's a saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I'm not feeling very comfortable about this, and wondering if maybe I'm too nervous.
Anybody want to?
Let me throw out another model. Is it 1914 or is it 1936 in the Spanish Civil War? Because when I look at the Russian behavior in Syria and I look at the Russian behavior in 1936 in Spain, there's a lot of parallels there too. I mean, what you're suggesting is far more worrisome than the Spanish Civil War model. But to be more optimistic, maybe what we're looking at is a situation like Spain. Let's hope it's like Spain.
If I could just add very briefly, I think the one thing that Russia doesn't want is a direct military confrontation with the United States in Syria or elsewhere. There's been Russia always postures, and as Robert said, they've been much more risky. They've engaged in riskier behavior than we do, but it is escalate to de-escalate. I cannot imagine. First of all, what the Russian public response would be if there was a direct confrontation. He likes to signal that he's dangerous and unpredictable, and that's why you need to let me do what I want to do in Syria. I don't think a direct confrontation like that is something that he wants. Or neither does he want to get stuck, I think, in a confrontation between Israel and Iran.
On that note, I'll just end by quoting, and I hope you're right, but I'll also quote Trotsky saying, "You might not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." So let's hope not. So anyhow, thank you very much, guys, for a great set of presentations, and thank you all.